How can I wait unknowing? This is the price of war. We rise with noble intentions, and we risk all that is pure. We are only as great as our hearts will allow. What awaits us?
All right, all right. Good afternoon, everybody. Glad you could join us here. We're just waiting to get set up a little bit longer. How are we all today? Well, decent's a good place to start, I suppose. Let's see. We're just getting set up here, waiting on Fairy Queen for a hot second. I'm all right. It's been a long day. It's been especially cold and dark, and I've had to clip Avery's nails in preparation for the snowstorms next weekend because uh, my cousin wants him to wear socks outside. So Avery's not great with getting his nails trimmed. So far it has been a trim one paw a day adventure. Oh, but just maybe put music on very softly. So something's happening. Yeah, he's just nervous, that's all. And a nervous dog is difficult to trim nails on because they try to take their paw away from you. So if you don't know, dogs have the quicken on their paw, on their claws, on their where if you go too deep, you hit a blood vessel and it's not going to clot, so you have to clot it for them with cornstarch or something. The problem is that there's nerve there, so if you do get that point, the dog is hurt. So I work very hard to avoid that spot, and if I'm doing that while he's trying to pull his paw away, it's tough. It's tough. So one paw at a time is all the trauma we can take. see what else is happening. Well, this week I might as well go over that. On Friday, we have a panel on Ukraine. Should be a good time. On Wednesday, we're going to have, as long as Hetman gets back to me in a short order, a discussion about the Articles of Confederation in regards to this year's election. So it should be a good time. Worth showing up for. Part of our political history series. What lessons we can take from history and when we go into the ballot box voting booth this November. We're just running a few minutes late, no big deal. Let's see if there's anything good happening in the meantime. Yeah, we're gonna get steamrolled when somebody comes on. That's about right. Yeah, the Articles of Confederation is an interesting discussion, I think, because it gets wrapped up in the mythology of the United States way too much. So separating out the Articles of Confederation from that kind of American myth and talking about what it really is, I think is going to be helpful for a lot of people. Let's go. Well, for the moment. Yeah, I talked about it in high school, but like, not well. And like the Articles of Confederation I talked about in high school is a road to talk about the Constitution, and to really get why it's important though, like, you miss parts. So the week after, or the show after the Articles is going to be Shays' Rebellion, and the Articles both cause Shays' Rebellion in an indirect way, and they make it so that the state of Massachusetts is unable to cope. All right, it looks like we're getting ready to go.
Set up.
How is it going?
Hey, I can hear you. How's it going with you?
Not bad, not bad. We are live on my end, at least.
Okay, perfect. And we are live on my end as well. I should let you know. Hi. Okay. First of all, thank you so much for agreeing to this conversation. Here, let me scooch over so that I am here in the Discord, so I am looking at you properly. I apologize. Let me go over here. Let me turn on my camera here so you can see me. There we go. Okay. Hi.
How's it going?
It's going great. First of all, thank you. I'm really, really grateful that you reached out to me and that you wanted to have this conversation. I am really, really curious about like what your perspective is, what your thoughts on women in the draft are. And I'd like to ask you a few questions about your background, anything you're willing to speak about. I know your channel, it seems to me, is focused on military history. Am I wrong for thinking that? Or I've seen you detail it before in some previous videos.
Yeah, so my name's Daedalus Media, and I am the co-host of Two Guys Talking History. So I am a military historian. My co-host is a genocide scholar. We talk a lot, actually, about current events, too. So I really do more military present than I do military history at this point. But as for me and my background, so when I was 18, when I was in high school, I was in junior ROTC, and I progressed on. I decided to become an officer. Around that same time, I was diagnosed with kidney disease. So I stayed in senior ROTC in college for about 3 years before I got out. But in that time, I got to know a lot of people who ended up becoming officers, some of whom are women who are currently serving military officers today. And my sister, for example, is one. So this is something I've kind of been involved with for a very long time. So I'm also very grateful you were able to come on today and have this discussion too. Because the previous one that spawned this was not it. Just not it.
No, it was not. I was actually disappointed that it was not. I was hopeful that there would have been some more research, that maybe some people who had military experience might have been able to speak on this. And so I'm very, very grateful that we got to speak together. I think that you and I are roughly on the same page, if I may. I think that, as I understand it, you think that women should be drafted and that we should support women being drafted. Or are you of the position that no one should be drafted?
So, no, if there's going to be a selective service registration, I think women should be included in that. I also think having had experience of working alongside women, working towards becoming military officers, a lot of stuff was said on and has been said, and it keeps being said about this. This is frankly untrue. Like getting ready for this, I started compiling my notes, and I was having some hard time finding some of the data I want. So I reached out to someone. I can't give out details because of DoD policies. But like I reached out to someone, and we had a long talk about the entire thing, and she pointed me to a number of things to bring up to you today too. About kind of getting rid of this essentialist idea that women are incapable of serving in combat roles, because I have been, obviously, for quite some time. So yeah, that's about where I'm at with that. And like all other things being equal, if a draft is going to happen, it's going to be a serious situation, and it's no time to start excluding people based on tradition.
I think that I would agree with you on that. So I think that I would agree with you that I think that selective service should apply to both men and women. I think that there is no logical reason for it to not, but I still want to steelman the case nonetheless. There were some points that were brought up during that discussion, in between some of the shouting and screaming, that I think are things that I do want to go into detail with you about. And one of the points that was brought up was the one by Ali. I think that's his name, Ali. And the point that he brought up was, if we have two pools of completely capable people, so if you have a group of completely capable men who are potential picks for the selective service, and you have pool B, which is entirely women who are picks for selective service, why would you pick pool B over pool A? Is that a legitimate, did you have any response to that? What are your thoughts on that?
So, for the last 30 years, we've had an all-volunteer military. So the thing about the draft has kind of changed, right? Uh, in my mind, it's become an emergency measure more than anything. So throughout most of the country's history, anytime we've gone to war, we've started drafting
Mhm.
people. World War One, World War Two, Vietnam, our big ones, but the Civil War.
Mhm.
Uh, very often, we never had a large standing military until after World War Two. Um,
Mhm.
in an event that we have a draft now, the situation is serious, right?
Mhm.
Um, so I'm not sure, like, I'm not sure that it would be a case of one
Mhm.
pool being better than the other or just needing bodies at that point.
Mhm.
So,
Okay.
yeah, like all other things being
Mhm.
equal, conscription isn't a regular thing for us here in the States.
Mhm.
And that's kind of, I think, probably a more important point than whether or not one group gets drafted or another.
Mhm. As a military historian, do you mind if I just ask for the audience's sake, how many times have we, as Americans, have we actually instituted a draft? Like, how many times in our nation's history has that happened, and under what conditions has that happened?
Let's see, formally, uh, there are periods like little things that the country's done that draft hasn't been instituted for, like things in Haiti and whatnot. American Mexican War, uh, Civil War, World War One, World War Two, and Vietnam would be the major conflicts that we have instituted draft. So it's been about 5, 6 times.
Mhm.
Uh,
Okay, so in under those circumstances, so this is a piece that was brought up tangentially, but really wasn't addressed. And part of my motivation for asking this panel to even come across it was because of what happened on October 7th, and it was because of the New York Times article that came out specifically about sexual assault that happened.
yeah,
I
I
think
saw
that
that.
is
I
a
saw your super chat on that.
yes.
Um, go
And
ahead and
how it relates to the draft, yeah. If I'm sorry, I hate to cut you off. The reason why I wanted to relate that to the draft is because the IDF requires, is it a draft? Is it a conscription? And what is the difference between those two things? As I understand it, women are required to serve in the military in the IDF. So the question is then, are female soldiers who would be conscripted, do they face unique challenges that male soldiers would not, specifically regarding sexual assault, specifically regarding pregnancy in the event of sexual assault? And is that a reason maybe to keep women out of the draft?
do they face unique challenges? Yes, both here and in other countries where that occurs. But by the same token, sexual assault and rape as a weapon of war is not going to necessarily be limited to active combatants. So, like for Israel's sake, uh, October 7th was
Mhm.
horrific, but not just soldiers are being assaulted; it was civilians being and held captive as
Mhm.
well. Um, in most of those circumstances, like uh, that particular item, I don't necessarily know if it changes much. It's kind of horrible to say, right?
Mhm.
But it's going to be a problem either way. In the case of a draft where your choice is kind of taken away, um, uh,
Mhm.
it's horrifying, and like I think it's a different question for Israel than it is the United States, right? We're very unlikely to be invaded. It's not like if you're drafted, you're going to be fighting on uh, American soil. So you are being sent
Mhm.
somewhere. And in Israel's case, they're not an expeditionary military. They're not that big, and they're getting into plenty of trouble all by
Mhm.
themselves in Israel. So, hang on. Sorry, my stream. There it goes. It's back again.
So it's the likelihood. Is that the
It's the likelihood, and
other words?
I pulled some
So
numbers.
is it a matter of
I kind of pulled some numbers about domestic sexual assault issues with the Pentagon and civilian population, and it's higher actually. About 1 in 4 per the Rand Corporation. 1 in 4 women in the military reports being sexually harassed, specifically sexually harassed. The
Mhm.
number for open assault was somewhat different, and I will be willing to grant, just as I would grant for the civilian population, that that's probably underreported. So
Mhm.
it's a problem, but there is something to it that I think is important. To the other question is whether we should allow women in combat arms, which we do currently. Is that true? I think having women be in more positions of authority, and both inside the military and outside, is probably the best way to hopefully quell, because we've talked about not sexually assaulting people for some time. Making people see it this from women's perspectives would be better, wouldn't it? I think it makes it less likely for people to want to engage in that behavior.
If I can ask the question then, so just as a counter to that though, so we do know that like women as of right now are probably more likely to engage in, is it fair to say that women are more likely to be involved in combat as American soldiers today than they would have been like 20 or 30 years ago? Like, I'm fairly certain that's the case. We have more female soldiers. We have women who are voluntarily choosing to serve in the armed forces now than they perhaps used to. Is that fair to say, or is that not fair to say?
Women.
And by serve, I mean serve as soldiers, like not as nurses, not as like.
It's been kind of a tiered thing. So, like, women have been fighter pilots, for example, since the 90s, which carries a high risk for of. If you're shot down, for instance, you're all on your own. We have more women serving in ground combat roles now since 2013. The number of women who serve in the armed forces hasn't really changed. The individual I spoke to prior to this said that there hasn't been a huge spike in the last 10 years, despite the fact that the job has opened up more. They still make up a minority of the armed forces overall. So it's possible. It's certain now that there are more women serving in combat roles, but I don't know if there's more women overall serving.
Okay. Well, I guess the reason why I ask is because if it's assumed that since 2013, like more women have been involved in boots on the ground combat roles, do we see a greater focus on sexual assault like since 2013? Like, do we see these changes like post that being instituted, or do we see more allegations? Do we see more people coming forward with accusations of abuse, specifically sexual assault?
There was an increase of about 1% of reports last year, from this year to 2022 to 2023. It's difficult to say. I've had this conversation with a couple different people. The military has a series of programs spearheaded by the Department of Defense trying to counter this. It makes sense on a certain level that you might get more reports overall as those efforts bear some fruit and get people to talk and to deal with those problems. And the other thing I have noticed is there's a lot more people being removed from command in the military. If you follow military news, they don't usually get in public. They don't usually get into the heavy details of what happened, but it usually comes across of this person's loss of ability to command, something like that. So there seems to be a lot of behind the scenes movement that you don't see a lot of front facing action on. That's it's very difficult to tell because this is not a transparent process, right? Sorry, that's not
spoken
a great answer.
No, that's okay. I have spoken to somebody who used to serve in the armed forces, and she told a story about the negative impacts of don't ask, don't tell. And one of the negative impacts that she said was that when there were male victims of sexual assault, that they were afraid of coming forward because they were afraid of being fired. They were afraid that if they came forward and if they mentioned if they accused, particularly if that person was in a high chain of command, that they would risk losing their jobs if they had done that. And so I wonder if maybe, like, not even just specifically with women, if an overall focus on sexual assault, like within the armed forces, is that in some way because of the fact that women have been introduced since post 2013, or is it simply, we're entering a more liberalizing society and is there some other force that's happening? I guess what I'm indicating.
I don't think it's a cause of some other force that's happening. I think it's more a societal effect. There's an interesting relationship between the American military and society at large, right? Oftentimes the military kind of ends up leading the way in some kind of socially liberalizing things. For example, they desegregated the army well before we desegregated uh, general society. And if you go like, so part of your component of officer cadet training in college is at least a semester of American military history. And the instructor I had for that, the officer, he was very proud, and so I've heard several other officers be very proud of that fact, that the military is usually at the forefront of social change. I think it's just in a general, more awareness has come up since even before 2013. You've had integrated units of some type for quite some time, and they've had these problems. And not unlike corporate culture, you have problems where powerful people can sweep things under the rug, and that's becoming less and less of a thing now. I don't think it's a direct result of opening up combat arms yet. It's still a very small number of women that are doing that. I think it's more across the whole military, support and combat together.
I want to speak to you specifically about combat. This was something that Stardust brought up. This was a point that she made like during that conversation. What she said was, just because you have a draft, it doesn't necessarily mean that if a woman is drafted, that she's immediately behind artillery, right, in a trench, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that. It could, yeah, it could mean that she's. It could mean that she is working in transport. It could mean that she's working as a cook. It could mean that she's doing a variety of other jobs that don't necessarily wind up with you on the front line. But there were a couple of responses to that I wanted to ask you about, and this was a surprising detail. And one detail I think that Alex Kirsch brought up was that apparently, like, you're more likely to die as a truck driver than you are as somebody who's actually an infantry soldier, like boots on the ground. But actually, like, the highest number of deaths actually comes from you transporting cargo. At least that's according to what he said. I don't know if that's true. And I also know that you mentioned, for instance, like pilots, for instance, right, earlier.
Yeah.
So, but then the question then becomes, right, well, you don't necessarily have, there's nothing physical about you driving a car, right, or you flying a plane, right? And yet you're more likely to die than, like, if you are doing this, right? So when this question comes up, do we just care about a person's physical ability to do the job, or is the weight of this concern mostly about, like, the sex of the person who will die, bluntly? In which case it is sexist, in which case there isn't an excuse. But it was an interesting point that I hadn't heard of before, and I wondered if you had anything to say about it.
So data for us is going to be weirdly skewed for the United States because we've spent the last 20 years fighting the war on terror in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Africa, right? And the unique thing about this, and one of the lessons people have took away in that discussion too, one of the call-ins afterwards, is that there wasn't front lines the way we envision them traditionally in those conflicts. So truck drivers were at a higher risk of danger because this was an insurgency and ambushes were more likely. And women have served in transportation units. Well, they were able to do so even before 2013. So there are a lot of women who are not strictly speaking in combat arms who are in combat throughout that course. And the physical argument, I guess, comes down to, there's a lot to talk about there, I think. So back when I was a cadet, the Army had the Army Physical Fitness Test. And it had a different set of standards for age brackets and a different set of standards for men and women. And the thing that was pointed out to me, because I haven't followed the new test nearly as much about the individual standards, because I don't have to actually pass that test, that there was a much greater degree of separation between what a acceptable score for a man was and an acceptable score for a woman in the same age bracket on the old test. And on the new test, in fact, I have it, the new chart.
Okay.
Let me bring it up here.
Absolutely.
I'm going to stick it over this and share it for you here.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, let me click watch stream. Let me see. Okay. What am I looking at here, Daedalus?
So this is the new Army Combat Physical Fitness Test grading scales.
Okay.
Overall, this new test is a lot. It has gone through a lot of changes since it got implemented back in 2013, and
Mhm.
it has 6 events as opposed to the 3 that were the older test. And each one you'll see here is a set of points. Maximum score is 100. A passing score is 60.
Mhm.
So they indicate what the maximum score is for each category and what the minimum score
Okay.
is at each age category. So there's basically a
One.
deadlift. The maximum score for a woman is 210 pounds, and the maximum score for a man for between 17 and 21 is 340. But the minimum scores are kind of what I think is important. Is
Mhm.
the minimum score for a woman in the same category is 120, and that for a man is
Mhm.
140. So the difference between capabilities is being measured differently and is less pronounced than it used to be. Um,
Mhm.
the problem that people have had is that we have not traditionally had women in combat arms. So
Mhm.
the answer to the question of whether people care about the sex of the person dying is, I think, for some parties that has a lot to do with it. Um, the
Mhm.
other half of that party is there's a group of people, particularly men, who feel that this is their domain and they're aggrieved that other people are being allowed into it.
Mhm.
The term vet bro was brought up, and basically everyone I talked to prior to this of somewhat
Mhm.
derisively for that category of man. Uh,
Can you explain what is a vet bro for those of us that don't know, that aren't acquainted?
sure, it's kind of derisive uh, commentary from someone who has served about an individual who served who makes that their entire personality. Uh, it's kind of considered the cringe of a veteran community, and
Okay. Okay.
it's exemplified. I think that the chief complaint from mill Twitter these days is you're acting like you're running Black Rifle Coffee, which is a
Okay.
company uh, with some infamy that has come out in the last 10 or so years.
It's interesting, isn't it? So I'm the daughter of a military brat. So I do know. I haven't ever heard the term that you've mentioned before, but I know what you're talking about. Like I have seen that before, and I've also seen like it's weird when you look at organizations like the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts or Civil Air Patrol. Like I would remember I would encounter people who had never served a day in their life. They weren't veterans, but they behaved as though they were, and they would speak to like the people, to the children and to the parents as though they were educating them to eventually become soldiers. It was very interesting. There is a weird militaristic
There's
boot
absolutely
to
there's
campaigning. Yeah.
absolutely a word for that too. We had in high school called Razzi Nazi. Uh, whether how much that got to you depended on how much your instructors batted you around the head a little bit to make sure you didn't do that. Um, military education is interesting, but yeah, there's absolutely a word for that. And but organizations like that, like Boy Scouts, the Civil Air Patrol
Mhm.
especially, because it's an after school volunteer thing for kids. At the very least, it has a huge adult
Mhm.
component as well. Um, kind of push people towards that in a certain sense. They kind of encourage it, or at least did when I was involved in those things. Um,
Mhm.
it's absolutely the kind of thing that happens, and it's widely regarded as silly, and hopefully you get educated out of it quickly. Usually,
Absolutely. So here's another point that I think Alex Kirsch brought up in the middle of our conversation, and that was there was a study apparently on mixed battalions, so on mixed units, so units that had both men and women. And he said that according to that study, that they don't perform as well as all male units. I'm not sure if like he brought up anything about an all female unit and whether or not it fared better or the same in comparison to men. But since we aren't talking about a true 50-50 draft, we are talking about a lottery. We're talking about people randomly being chosen and randomly being placed into units. Is that not a concern then about having a mixed sex unit and maybe not providing the strongest offense possible or defense possible?
so that is a 2015 study that was commissioned by the Marine Corps. It has since been pretty widely discredited. Um, I
Oh,
would
really? Okay.
Yeah, there's a Guardian article I can send you that talks about that particular study and some of the methodological issues with it. Um, the study in and of itself is kind of citing a very similar argument that was made when, for example, in the Civil War, when we started introducing all black regiments, it was thought they wouldn't fight as effectively. That turned out not to be the case. African Americans served with quite distinction in the Civil War. It was brought up again, especially explicitly when the military considered desegregation. It was brought up even more recently around the time that, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was being repealed. It's a perennial argument that people make about military units, is that mixing them in a way that they have not mixed before is going to reduce their effectiveness. And for a time, that can be the case, absolutely. But then eventually the unit gets over it and gets on with it. So I don't think that's necessarily a new argument that's being made.
Okay.
It's a pretty old one. It always kind of gets put aside after the issue is decided, and then we act like it was a good idea all along. So let me find that Guardian article real quick.
Absolutely. And just to be very clear, like the truth of that is that it is difficult at first for those units, but that eventually it's a hump that they get over. Is that essentially what is the actual truth behind that claim? Or is it never true? Like it is actually easy for them to work together and it's just, exaggerated numbers.
It's been going on. There's been integrated units for a very long time. And when something that was not integrated is integrated, it affects them, obviously. It's a change, and change is difficult for anyone, right? It's the same kind of concept. Whether or not there's a danger depends on when it occurs and depends on when the unit actually goes into combat. And for the most part, we haven't had that problem where we've had this throw somebody who's not ready into a situation.
I know we've mentioned obviously the physical differences between men and women in terms of strength, the differences between judging and the criteria by which women have to pass in order to serve in combat. But I guess I wanted to ask you, are there any unique concerns about sending a woman into combat that we wouldn't necessarily think of, right? The immediate thing people think of is sexual assault. The immediate thing people think about is the physical capability of being able to lift things and to carry. Are there any other points, though, that are points of concern that maybe most people wouldn't think or consider?
One of the ones has been equipment-based in the past. So you've had women in military police units or those transport units who've been pressed into combat and are being equipped with things like body armor, for example, is a really good one. The body armor system that we designed and is a standard issue for soldiers, or at least was in the last 10 years or so, was not suited for a woman's physique. Having breasts makes it a much more difficult task to wear body armor. So this body armor became less safe for them to wear because it didn't conform properly. There are design issues, engineering issues in that kind of manner that have come up that are definitely things that we have to take into account. But those are very correctable issues as well. So that's certainly one of those particular issues. Outside of that, a lot of the same things is like women like go camping, and you have to adapt to things like using the restroom, and it's the same thing in the military. So it's not unique challenges necessarily, but like it's things you have to consider based on your biology.
Absolutely. Here's another aspect of considering like women joining in the military. So I mentioned the concern of sexual assault, but that was from the perspective of the enemy, right? So the enemy kidnapping your forces and sexually assaulting, a female prisoner of war as opposed to a male prisoner of war, and what concerns there might be. But there's another way to think about the concern of sexual assault that's not from the perspective of the enemy, right? It's from the perspective of your unit, right? So are women who are in mixed units, are they more likely to face sexual harassment or sexual assault from their male colleagues, for lack of a better word? Is that perhaps a concern if we were to institute a draft?
I think it's a concern whether we have a draft or not. It's a current concern, and the military has programs like Sharp that are working that are basically the Me Too of the military, trying to work to counter those things. The efficacy of it and then how well it's regarded is a mixed bag. Uh, the military reports slightly higher numbers overall, like I said before, of sexual harassment, and they report very low numbers of actual sexual assault. But again, much like a regular population, I'm absolutely sure that's being underreported, and so are most other people
Mhm.
I talk to. And I don't have a good answer for by how much, without admitting that it's fully unfounded.
You're in a very stressful scenario, in a stressful situation. I would think that that might raise the likelihood of sexual assault in a way that I would think that, like, in a way, and I've spoken even to some people who have served in the infantry. Like, I remember, like, I spoke to a person, like, these are some rough guys, right? These are people whose entire job it is to shoot and to track down the enemy, right?
Sure.
Do you see where I hope you can see where I'm going with this, right? This isn't like your average infantry soldier with a pack on his back and a gun in his hand is not quite the same, right? Who's been trained to do this job is not quite the same as your average grocer or baker, right? Who is, they're not necessarily, who isn't necessarily cut out for that line of work.
Sure, but I don't necessarily think if, and I'm not saying that's what you're implying, I don't think that means that they're incapable of acting with discretion or restraint either. It's always going to be sexual assault and is about power in the end. And I am obviously preaching to the choir here, but like it becomes about who wants to feel empowered and who has a bad attitude, and about like women. All those things are still going to be problems either way. I don't know if it's necessarily more dangerous on that front. It's certainly, because there's a case of isolation and a power structure, it's much harder to rectify. Absolutely. It's even more difficult than in regular society, and that's already a horrifying set of statistics.
Well, I think that what I am directly implying is that because the stakes are much higher in a combat situation as opposed to like an ordinary situation, because you might die tomorrow, that the likelihood of not even sexual assaults, but just fights within the unit, it would seem to me that those types of like disagreements might be more likely to happen as opposed to, in the boardroom, right? Or in the teacher's lounge, or I'm trying to think of another male dominated field, or like in Silicon Valley, right? Like when you're coding, like with your fellow programmers, right? The fact that it is a stressful situation, the fact that, like there quite literally are buildings being blown up right next to camp.
If that
is this not a concern?
If that's occurring in a situation, I'm going to be frank, that is a failure on the non-commissioned officers and the commissioned officers in the unit. We're supposed to keep a capstone on that. Keep that well capped. That's a leadership problem if that's happening. I don't know if that's more likely in other jobs, because there are people whose job is specifically to keep that from happening. In those cases, that's kind of like keeping good order and discipline is very much the role of the squad and platoon NCOs in that case.
So have they been successful in mixed units? So like, do we have a history of them being successful of keeping a cap on it?
So far, in those cases in the Global War Terror, I have not read, and it's a massive, both wars have produced very massive documents, and I haven't finished them so far, but I have not read about serious systemic discipline issues in the American military in Iraq or Afghanistan. These are like 27,000 page documents. They are quite lofty.
Well, I mean, like, to be specific, I mean discipline issues regarding like mixed units as opposed to all male units. Like if there are more discipline issues like within between all male units or single sex units as opposed to mixed units. I forget, like ignoring like whether or not they're more effective or not. Like, are there more potential discipline issues because of the concern of sexual assault, or because of the fact that because it is that hump that you do to get out over.
Yeah, there are unique issues to be sure. Like prior to women being in combat arms, they didn't have to worry about those issues in combat in direct line units. Now they do. Uh, there are unique issues like, and there's a certain amount of segregation that was always happening in the field. Like women would be placed in their own, uh, well, barracks and billets by themselves, and there was a certain amount of segregation and kind of watching to make sure no one got up to any kind of funny business, mutual or otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Not always successful, obviously, but
right. I've heard that as well from some female veterans who have spoken to me about this. I have another question for you. It's about SHARP. You mentioned SHARP. What is that? What is that movement?
It's a program, and it's an acronym. I apologize. I do that too often.
No, that's all good.
So it's the Department of Defense's efforts. It's called Sexual Harassment Assault Prevention Program. It quite literally SHARP, but it's the formalized tools and trainings that they require for to try to reduce sexual assault. So it kind of translates into, to be perfectly frank, kind of like the HR stuff that you would do in a regular company, talking about what is appropriate and what is inappropriate type, and like making people aware and having a coordinator available to deal with complaints, things like that. So it's not necessarily run through the Army's, at least in my understanding from the Army, directly through the Army's HR. It can be an entirely separate individual, but it's kind of the same thought process.
Okay. And has it been successful in reducing or at least in allowing like reporting of sexual assault or sexual harassment? Like, has the program overall been a success?
So the Department of Defense says. I have heard a couple different takes, and it's depended heavily by base. So I've heard some bases are much worse than others on this program. Okay. And that's kind of where the seeing more commanders getting fired more often comes in, is when they identify problems with that. Those are oftentimes the not stated reason why someone is being removed, because they created a hostile command environment towards programs that the Army considers essential.
Between the bases that have had these problems and the bases that have not had these problems? I know you mentioned like commanders being removed. Is this more likely to happen on a larger base, bluntly, as opposed to a smaller base, like where everyone is in everyone's business? Or
smaller bases, so the bases run the gamut. The one I'm thinking of in specific is formerly called Fort Hood in Texas. It's massive, a huge Army community. They've had a lot of very public problems also in the last couple of years too. You might have heard of in these regards. That base has been listed as pretty infamous to me, as having a lot of problems with the reporting program. Usually, when these things are working very well, you don't hear much about them. So, like, can I say what bases specifically? No. Not really. There doesn't seem to be a major pattern. The problem, the other half of the equation is you don't know about a problem until it hits the news, usually, because these aren't necessarily open communities in the same way as corporations are. And by the time you hit about that, they're keeping things private because there might be court-martial proceedings pending too. So.
Well, ironically, I think that you've hit something it's important too. Like, I remember, like, you're right, it is a closed community. Like, I don't know if enough people understand just how closed of a community a base can be, especially like if you're overseas. Like, I remember like living on base. You know, you had the grocery, you had the BX, right? You had the Anthony's Pizza, right? You had the food court. You had like a single place where you had the commissary. You would buy all of your groceries from this one store. You would have one movie theater, one library, right? And especially like if you're overseas, like, yes, you can go off base and yes, you can go into the community and into the village, but really, like, it is a very tight-knit, close-knit community, right?
Absolutely. And that creates all the problems you might imagine that creates too, in terms of like who does what. One of the chief things I've seen complained about from friends and acquaintances in the military is how often they have a particular problem with double standards. And some,
Mhm.
like, you'll have two people who basically do the same thing, and someone gets an Article 15 and someone gets a court martial. An Article
Mhm.
15 is in the Uniform Code of Military Justice, is a non-judicial punishment. So you uh, basically just take the punishment. It's usually not affecting you, like you're
Mhm.
not going to jail type things. Um, and that's all part of it. Uh, though from a standpoint of these communities are tight, officers know officers, and they're all vying
Mhm.
to advance their careers, and there are problems. Um, these are problems that exist, but again, I'd stress
Mhm.
these aren't any different than you'll find in academic settings or corporate settings. Um, but
I don't.
the closedness of the community certainly makes it an issue.
Well, that's sort of what I wonder, right? Like, so for instance, like suppose like we have like a wife and she wants to accuse her, or even like not a wife, just a spouse of an officer who wants to accuse their spouse, the officer, of committing domestic violence, right, or of sexually assaulting them. I would think that because they're on a closed base, especially if they're overseas, hundreds of miles away from their family, everything that they do, everywhere that they go is so ingrained within the military. I would think that it would be much more difficult to file an allegation against your spouse, wouldn't it? In that instance of as at least like if you're even if it's true, and I don't deny that it's true, that in academia and that in corporate, like in civilian life, of course, like domestic violence happens, of course, sexual assault happens, right? But your entire life is not necessarily all around the university, right? You can leave the university, you can leave with greater ease. You don't have to do everything on campus, right? Same thing applies like if you have a corporate job, you don't have to live like in a compound with, this isn't the Versailles of Silicon Valley, right?
Right. Yes.
So the concern would be that like if you are the spouse of a military officer, and if you're stationed somewhere overseas and it literally is your home base, right? Isn't there an incentive to be less likely to report it as opposed to if you're somebody who is a civilian who lives off base?
I mean, I think absolutely. Um, the it's exactly the same kind of phenomenon that people talk about uh, when they try to make you dependent in an abusive relationship. You are dependent. That's the reality of the situation. So the atmosphere on the base is very important in that case. Like if you have to leave, is there someplace you can go? Type things. Those are all huge problems. I don't. I think it's a tiered problem too, right? Because uh, especially at least here in the States, it's a tiered problem.
Mhm.
Uh, I have to mute this thing because people are talking in my Discord for some reason. Hang on. It's a tiered problem because like it's a bigger problem if you have to live on base housing than off because you're
Mhm.
consuming military services at that point. Um, the all right, sorry, so I apologize about that. The
What?
uh, it's a big problem. I don't know. I don't know if there's a specific fix for that again, though.
Mhm.
Like, and I hate this. I hate to be that way. I do because these are things that matter to me immensely, with family and close friends in the military. Um, I don't know what a separate fix is. A good
Mhm.
separate fix, and that particular problem of with spouses is going to exist regardless of whether we allow women to serve in combat roles or not. Um,
That's
there's a
true.
cultural problem. There is. There absolutely is. That's why they pay attention to it for the sharp programs. Um, I just don't know what I don't know.
What the solution is or should
Yeah,
be.
and I hate it because I feel like we need a solution
Mhm.
in regular everyday life too, because it's obviously
Mhm.
horrifying. Like,
Yeah.
The problem I've always had is I have a lot of friends who are women who have told me things that have happened to them, and it feels like more than the statistics say it should to me personally,
Mhm.
and it bothers me because I don't know what's wrong in this world for this to happen.
Yeah.
And
No, I don't blame you at all for that.
it's really
If
hard.
I'm, yeah.
It's just
Do
really
you
hard
mind? Yeah, to
to
talk
answer.
about it. Yeah. Do you mind sharing what some of those, and obviously nothing too personal, but do you mind sharing like what some of the things that you've heard off, like obviously changing names and locations and everything, but what are some things that you've heard from female veterans, from women who are wives, women who have been involved in some aspect in the military regarding issues like sexual assault, women in combat, DV, that kind of thing?
So we have a retired naval commander who works with us over here at Two Guys Talking History, and he and I have had a couple conversations. One of his last jobs was in the Pentagon before he retired. Was in the Pentagon, in the Inspector General's office. Um, they have their different branches because do investigations of other branches instead of their own branch. Because if you're investigating the Air Force and you're in the Navy, you don't have any career reason to ignore a problem, for example, like that, or less of a reason, right? He talked about an individual that was recalled back to service who was a commander of a base, who would extort the officers under his command's wives for sex. Um, in order to get favors for those officers, such as not
Mm-hmm.
having them deployed or something along those lines. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Stuff like that are certain things I've heard, and then you hear individual cases of sexual harassment and violence and everyday occurrences. Like a woman might be walking by a area and a bunch of men catcall to her, things like that. It,
Mm-hmm.
the whole set of behaviors um, can run from pretty mundane, horrifying stuff to like I described with that officer, because you have such huge power imbalances that are created.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that's a sufficient enough answer there.
No, no, it is a sufficient enough answer. It's something else. I have another question for you, and this is a bigger question. It's a broader question, but I want to ask you, since you are a military historian, if you wouldn't mind like laying out sort of the history of like women's involvement in the military, if that makes sense. So, when were women first introduced into combat? When were women first allowed to be pilots? Women serving in any capacity. Like, what is the history of women serving in the United States military? What is women's involvement in the military been historically?
So I think the first person I would kind of highlight uh, is someone like Sally Ride, who is strictly speaking in NASA, but there are enormous physical strains being placed on women pilots and women astronauts, and women have been astronauts for quite some time, since the 70s in the case of Sally Ride. Um,
Mm-hmm.
as for the kind of so the basic
Mm-hmm.
timeline breaks down like this. In 1993, the Air Force and the Navy removed restrictions from women being combat pilots. So they could now
Mm-hmm.
fly fighters, they could fly bombers. And they did those things throughout the 90s and the Second Gulf War and the global war on terror. Um, Women have always been able to serve in most of the support units in the Army and the Marine Corps. This led to a lot of women getting into combat situations even before they were formally allowed in combat arms. If you're of a certain age, you'll remember the Second Iraq War, that early period of time, and the story of Jessica Lynch, which probably speaks very much to some of your concerns, I think, with what happened
Mm-hmm.
to her, if you remember that story. Um,
I don't remember that story. Would you mind telling that story for the audience?
okay, yes. So back when we invaded Iraq in 2003, we had a number of expectations of what the Iraqi army was going to do. We thought they would use the rivers and try to mount a defense there. They, remembering Desert Storm, decided not to do this. So they gather up in the ones that do fight, gather in cities. One of those cities was Nasiriyah, which is where this takes place. It was the first big city the American forces encountered in 2003. Um, so they we accidentally declare that city secured, and Jessica
Mhm.
Lynch is in a supply unit, and her entire unit moves into that city, Nasiriyah, without a map, or a number of important pieces of equipment, really. They
Mhm.
get ambushed, and they take heavy casualties, and Jessica Lynch is captured.
Mhm.
She's a private. It instantly makes headline news here because it's a woman who's been captured. Uh, People start horrifically speculating on what's happening to her, and
Mhm.
in their defense, a lot of horrible things do happen to her. She's beaten. She's raped. All of those things. I hope you don't want to be monetized ever.
It's okay.
Yeah. Anyway, she's beaten. She's raped. Eventually, she is rescued. Uh, and she's kind of one of the first big names that we have in that war. Um, it's fairly significant. There's a lot of events that go on around that battle for Nasiriyah. It's depicted actually in uh, the miniseries Generation Kill as well, and Jessica Lynch is specifically
Mhm.
referenced there in one of the early episodes. So like it was a big deal at the time. Um, it's a big deal because of the attitude we take in society towards women, I think, but it's also a big deal because she
Mhm.
suffered horribly. Um, Throughout that, throughout that, beyond that, you have a women participating in combat actions just based off the nature of the Iraq and Afghanistan war, where they're driving down the road and they get shot at, and they have to defend the convoy. Uh, there was
Mhm.
a couple notes that were sent to me. For example, an individual, Leigh Ann Hester, who is a American woman, she wins the Silver Star. She's a military police unit, not strictly speaking combat arms, but she wins the Silver Star for actions in combat protecting a military convoy in 2005. Uh, the change comes for the Army and the Marine Corps, at least, is in 2013. Um,
Mhm.
so 2013 is a couple of years after I'm medically denied. My sister, though, is commissioning, and her roommate is
Mhm.
one of the first people allowed into a combat arms unit. Uh, so she goes to an artillery unit, and they kind of
Mhm.
phased this in. So first they let new officers try out, and then in 2015 they let NCOs, and then so on and so forth. And it wasn't fully integrated till about 2017.
Mhm.
Um, there were some problems for her from my sister's roommate when she first goes there. There were different expectations placed upon her. For example, they would tell the members of the battery, go run 3 miles, and then they just tell her
Mhm.
to run until she got tired. Kind of like that subtle, sometimes not so subtle, do you belong
Mhm.
here kind of hazing type thing, taken to a somewhat more ridiculous extreme. Uh,
Mhm.
a lot of those things, that's why they did it in phases, so they could try to work out that problem. Um, how successful it's been again depends heavily on the unit so far. It's I think
Mhm.
why we see so many high-ranking officers being relieved these days is because they have not addressed those problems adequately. So there
Mhm.
is an attempt to find leaders who will do so.
Do you think that those attempts will be successful given the current culture? It feels as though we're in a, I'm not sure what things like the me positions of power that seem to be, yeah. But it seems as though the pendulum might be swinging in the opposite direction. Is that something that is occurring within military culture as well, or is that some, or am I completely wrong? Do you not think that's happening at all?
I am wary of taking what I see to be gospel, right? Because I'm not
Mhm.
necessarily well positioned enough to say overall for society. Um, I, I
Mhm.
I feel it happening in some places, but then some days I don't feel it happening. I see someone standing up and doing it, and challenging someone and coming forward about what they've experienced. So it's hard to
Mhm.
say overall. Um, Whether or not it remains a problem in the military and whether or not it's successful, I think it takes time. All these things always
Mhm.
take time. Like there's an attitude that people have brought to this for generations that women could not do the job, and that's been proven decisively wrong. But now you've got to get people
Mhm.
to accept that. And there's
Mhm.
a lot of crazy stuff that goes. So one of the callers at the end of that panel, right, talked about women requiring being escorted back to base for the shower. So I asked
Mhm.
about this a number of people that are serving or served if they've ever observed this problem in field training,
Mhm.
and no one said they had. Even
Mhm.
people who said like we've had integrated units and we've not had principal issues, we've just had assigned shower times, blah 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 blah, stuff like that. Like there's an attitude, and there's a very loud portion of people that are always going to speak out against what they perceive as something that's wrong, and I don't
Mhm.
know how much of the majority they actually are. I feel like the only answer I can give, and it's again not a satisfying one, is we have to wait and see.
Mhm. That's a fair answer to give. So I have a couple of historical points I wanted to bring up with you. It's not military history, but it is feminist history. And one example of this was the death of the ERA. So the death of the ERA in the 70s was largely in part due to Phyllis Schlafly really hammering home the point about women serving in the draft. Like she very consistently, it's one of the things that killed the ERA movement in the 70s was the fact that she decided to launch a campaign against the ERA. And one of the major points that she brought up during that time was, do you want your daughter serving, do you want your daughter to be drafted? This was an emotional point that she used in order to, fire back at people like Betty Friedan during that time.
Yes.
And so do you think, but one thing that really surprised me about that time was the fact that many Republicans actually were supporting the ERA and seemed to be in support of the ERA prior to Phyllis Schlafly, taking the reins of this. And also, it seems as though, like some of the research that I looked at in preparation for this seems to indicate that, in fact, there are many conservative voices that, in fact, would support women signing up for the draft today in a modern day context. And so I wondered if you had any perspective to bear on that.
Well, first of all, Phyllis Schlafly and her sons are probably some of the worst things that have ever happened to discourse in the United States. Uh, uh, Inarguably.
I
Uh,
disagree.
so Phyllis Schlafly, she had a lot of points against the ERA. That was one of them. And I think when she made that point, particularly around the time she made that point, it's the 60s and the 70s, and it's the Vietnam War, and the draft is a huge
Yeah.
psychological scar for America and Americans. It's a very effective argument then, and largely because of that. Uh,
Mhm.
the 70s is also a kind of the 70s is the advent of the conservative movement that you and I experience today. It's the resurgence of
Mhm.
the NRA as a Second Amendment absolutist organization. It's kind of this reaction to the 60s. It's the resurgence of the evangelical Christian movement that kind of builds and builds and builds into what we see today.
Mhm.
Phyllis Schlafly was very well positioned to make those kinds of arguments at that time. There was this period of change, like what it means to be conservative was changing, which I think accounts a lot for your observation there of conservatives being in support of the ERA at the time, and are less so now. The arguments that I have heard about the ERA in the modern day usually are focused around not wanting to add to the Constitution, and that
Mhm.
the 14th Amendment is supposed to be sufficient, and that's arguably not the case.
Mhm.
But it's not even really that argue about the case. That's just me being generous. I don't know if those same arguments that Phyllis Schlafly made in the 70s would be as effective today.
Mhm.
There are different attitudes. It's a lot harder to make an argument against the draft when you have women being allowed to serve in combat roles. Now for going on
Mhm.
30 years, starting with fighter pilots. I don't know if those would be the same kind of arguments that we've made today. Maybe
Mhm.
Phyllis Schlafly will find something better to do with her time anyway. We can hope.
Maybe so. Do you think that some of the reaction also had to do with the fact that it was televised? So people were watching, their sons being blown up on screen at home, right? They were not just like, or is that overblown? Is it like people were watching this? They had access to filmed footage of people like serving in Vietnam. in a way that we really didn't, like when we think about like the serving in Iraq or Afghanistan, right? I mean, you can see like a plane dropping a bomb, maybe, or a drone plane, right? But you don't actually see like on television, CNN, you don't see, soldiers' boots on the ground with soldiers, charging into a village with a reporter with a camera in the back.
Yeah,
That isn't.
We changed what we show the public directly.
Mm-hmm.
That's swinging the other way again, too, I would point out, what we see coming out of combat zones, because now people are able
everyone has a cell phone now. Yeah.
That I think has a huge deal. People viscerally saw, especially 68, and like things like the Tet Offensive, have a very huge effect on the American public because they're watching the combat on their TV sets, or at least parts of it. They're able to see these things, and we change what we show people. So what a lot of people remember from Desert Storm, when I was very young at that point, but they talk about afterwards, is how the misperception we have that like we use a whole bunch of guided bombs, when that's what we showed on the TV. Like they thought it was this war where people press buttons and drop bombs and that was it. Those haven't been the case. We've changed what we show. So the footage that we get back is different. Our impression of these things is different. And to be perfectly frank, the military and Department of Defense have worked very hard to change the perception of what happens on the ground in order to not affect recruitment numbers. So they fund things like they'll assist video game manufacturers in making military video games, or they'll fund these NFL flyovers and displays to try to make the public favorably disposed towards the military, because they learned that if they don't do it, no one else will. And they consider this an essential tool.
Here's another question, and this again is a historical point, right? And this goes back to, so if indeed, so I looked at the constitutionality of, the selective service only selecting for men, right, and for women not being required to serve. It seems as though, I will check my notes here, there was a challenge to that made in, I think, 2016, though I could be wrong. But I think that the Supreme Court changed its decision. Are you aware of the case that I'm referring to? Like, why is it still constitutional? Like, why? Like, because people have, I'm sure, like, have filed suits against this before who have challenged the constitutionality of it. So what is the barrier for this being flipped?
So the Constitution doesn't really speak to what comprises the draft and what comprises conscription. It gives Congress the power to raise money to raise an army, and it gives Congress the power to regulate that army. So there's nothing inherent to the Constitution that you'd be able to say, well, here in Article 1, Section blah, 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 says this. So the Supreme Court had a hard time, I think, deciding on that in the first place. That ultimately it has to be a power that rests with Congress. And they don't really also have the power to tell Congress how to administer the military. The opposition to having it flipped, I think, is less that there's opposition and more that the people who should be thinking about this are not.
Okay.
There are concerns that are being raised in some corners about readiness. Not to call out the Navy again, but for example, the Navy not having enough shipyards to rapidly expand their capacity, things like that. The general consensus has been if there is a situation where we get into a near peer conflict with China, the draft is going to happen. That's the most likely case.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. So number one, if that's the case, then if, for instance, and I'm not saying that this would happen, but like if, for instance, Congress, for instance, wanted to be discriminatory in another way with the selective service. So let's say they only wanted to select straight, like for instance, like, so does that mean then, like, is there no constitutional, what is the legal infraction then, for instance, for don't ask, don't tell, for instance, for not allowing, gay men, for instance, to serve in the military, right? Is there, if it's not, is it not the equal protect? I could be wrong. I'm sorry. I'm probably misquoting it. Is it the Civil Rights Act? is that the reason why? Is it the equal protections clause? Why couldn't the military be discriminatory in other ways other than simply selecting men then, if that's true?
Well, so I kind of remember Don't Ask, Don't Tell going away really well, because it happened when I was still a cadet.
Mhm.
Or actually, it happened as I was just being medically denied. So it was very
Mhm.
around the same time, that 2010 mark. The argument was the argument you would think logically, if you applied it,
Mhm.
that the equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment would be applied here, but that
Mhm.
wasn't found by the courts to not be the case. The
Mhm.
issue for part of the military is that they effectively operate under a separate set of laws for
Mhm.
the reason that they have a specific job to do in the defense of the nation. Uh,
Mhm.
Let's actually look. Because as far as I remember, what happened in 2010 was the Obama administration decided not to challenge or defend the constitutionality of Don't Ask, Don't Tell in court.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah, there was that. Commander McMillan's making an excellent point in my chat that LGBTQ individuals were seen as a security risk because of
Mhm.
the potential for blackmail. But you could just as easily turn around and point out that this is a problem brought on by society and not some inherent
Yeah.
essential characteristic.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah.
they made the decision, though, not to challenge it. And that I don't think they brought standing. Anyone else was given standing to defend it,
Mhm.
if I recall correctly. Like, it was a kind of a big. It was a already dying deal in 2010. It was becoming
Mhm.
less and less of an issue. Like, there were obviously hardcore people still about it, but
Mhm.
for example, on my campus, when the Westboro Baptist Church uh, came to do their thing on my campus back in the day, ROTC cadets made up a huge contingent of the counter protesters in civilian clothes, obviously, but we're not having that. Uh, um,
Mhm.
the essential legal argument kind of went by what we thought was efficacious for the defense of the nation at the
Okay.
time.
So then, like, theoretically, like, if you were going to make the case then for women to serve, like, to have to sign up for the selective service, it would have to be from the standpoint of the efficacy for the nation. You couldn't you couldn't say this violates the Civil Rights Act, this violates the Equal Protections Clause. You couldn't make that. It doesn't sound like there would be a legal foundation for that. It would have to be based off of the needs for the nation.
Yes, this is the ideal. So, like, for example, the individual who I principally talked to is getting like some behind the scenes information. Mention that this is
Mhm.
not a question of equality where we need a 50-50 split or something along those
Yeah.
lines. It's the question of equity, the ability to have the option to do the thing. Like,
Mhm.
I go, if you wanted to be a woman in the military, you go, you do the thing, and if long as you come up to the standard that everyone else does, and you aren't, for example, held to a higher standard for some reason, that's what has to happen. Um,
Mhm.
in the case of the draft, like, there's not been the same kind of move, I think, to have it apply to
Mhm.
women as well. Uh, a
Mhm.
outside of, like, the fear mongering
Mhm.
that happens at the outset of any kind of international crisis, we don't think about the draft that much as a nation, really.
Mhm.
It doesn't come up because we've had, since the end of the Vietnam War, that all volunteer force.
Mhm.
We have assumed that there will be sufficient soldiers available to protect us in a war because we haven't fought those big wars. 2023 was the first time in decades that we've seen an increase in conflict and instability around the globe. I think that
Mhm.
time is changing. So reconsidering this is
Mhm.
going to happen.
When you say that that time is changing, do you mean, just to be very, very clear, do you think that, and I actually want to specifically ask you about China, because I recently read an article, and it was an article that suggested that were we to enter into a war with China, we would not be prepared, and the United States would have our asses spanked and handed back to us. And I know this is a little off topic, but you did mention that, like, if you thought that, like, if we were to engage with China, there's a possibility that the draft might be resurrected. So I guess I want to ask you that question. Do you see that on the horizon? Is that something that you've thought about, or that I know that's off? I know that's not what we were here to talk about
Sure,
today.
no problem.
But I am curious. Yeah.
So my thoughts on China kind of vary. I have had a lot of interesting conversations with various people who are kind of involved in this, like Chinese dissidents, American military personnel, and whatnot. And I've heard a lot of different opinions. Basically, everyone in the American military that I've spoken to is absolutely convinced that it's going to happen. However, institutionally, that's what you're paid to do. So they have to think that. Some of the people I've spoken to who are from China, who are experienced with China, the Communist Party of China, feel that so long as China is not directly challenged in Taiwan, they will not invade Taiwan. So this is an election-dependent thing, ultimately, right? There's Taiwanese elections coming up. How those happen determines what China does. As long as they can maintain the fiction plausibly that Taiwan, there was but one China, and its capital is in Beijing, they probably won't do anything, is kind of the feeling there. There are so many unknowns between then and there, though, for me to give a good answer.
Of course.
Here is what I will say to that article about, and I've seen this from a number of different places. There are capability gaps that we need to address. We would be hard pressed with what we have available now to fight a full-on war all the way in Taiwan on their behalf. We wouldn't be alone in those cases. We have changed the constitution, we haven't, but Japan has changed their constitution to allow them to build a expeditionary military again. We are getting Australia heavily involved in anti-China efforts. And India and China are traditional enemies, and they don't get along to begin with. And both of these are two rising military powers who don't like one another. The other half of that equation is China comes from an old Cold War mentality, the same as Russia, about military equipment. They say they can do a great many things. And we kind of take them at their word, and that might be ill-advised.
Okay. So you think that they over exaggerate? Well, I mean, it's not surprising, but they exaggerate their military, the amount of military forces that they have. Essentially, like it's the lizard with the giant frills around its face, right? It looks scarier than it actually is.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily a size thing. I think it's a capability thing. So what China has done, and we have noted, is they like to take Russian stuff and American stuff and kind of reverse engineer it into their own stuff and say, well, we made this. And the question is, how good a job are they doing at that? Also, we've had a lot of breaks because of Ukraine in that regard. For example, an advanced Russian fighter was shot down early in the war. It uses the same avionics package as China's new Generation 5 fighter, the J-20 Mighty Dragon. So the Ukrainians just handed that package, that crashed plane over to us, and we now have the ability to jam China's new fighters. So, like, there is a cultural thing of it, especially if you are a big arms dealer like China and Russia, to overstate what your stuff can do. So it's also very possible that China might kind of stumble out of the gate the same way Russia did in Ukraine.
I want to end with, this is a heavy note, but I also think maybe a note that speaks to like what you were saying earlier about the importance of having women in positions of authority and women in positions of power in the military. And it's a story about the rape camps during the Bosnian War and how rape became understood as a form of ethnic cleansing and how rape became understood as a form of genocide and not simply something that naturally happens in war. I know that your co-host is a genocide scholar. I don't want to speak about it like if you want to talk about it, but I know that like my understanding of the story is that there were female historians who went to these camps and would interview many of these women and then took these stories and then proposed essentially that like rape be now understood as a form of ethnic cleansing. And prior to that, there were many, frankly, like leftist pundits who were arguing it shouldn't be. Michael Parenti was one. Christopher Hitchens sneered at the idea of it being considered that. Noam Chomsky was someone who also sneered at that. And I was wondering, like, if you had any input on that specific topic.
So, oh, hang on. I'll address that in a minute, Commander. The answer to that question is yes. This is a massively complicated topic. Last January, we did a multi-part couple streams on genocide, on war crimes, the differences and whatnot. There, in the thing, we talk about Raphael Lemkin and the whole determination of what is and is not genocide, too. The question, is this is not a new understanding. It's always been in the background for a lot of scholars of atrocities, of this understanding of like, again, rape is about power, and it becomes a weapon in that way to dehumanize people. So it was used in the Holocaust. It was used before that. It's been being used for generations, from a general understanding, as far back as humans have been waging war. We have been engaged in that kind of activity. It's very much a case of getting it recognized and talking about it in terms of the scale of a crime against humanity. Like you said, it was being brought up as ethnic cleansing. It's very difficult to get something added to genocide as a charge because of the players involved there and the histories of the Security Council, specifically the United States and the Soviet Union. We have come to a better understanding of that. So the New York Times article that you talked about at the beginning, it brought up, it was obviously, it's obviously designed to bring up those things, and they're horrible, but it also doesn't talk about the fact that there are horrifying reports coming out of Israeli prisons for Palestinians. It's a really common problem. It is a crime against humanity. It's designed it's designed as part of a larger thing to dehumanize people, right? To make it okay to harm them, to make them less than.
If I may stop you for a very brief moment, and I do apologize. I was wondering if you could speak to that maybe a little bit about Israeli soldiers using rape as a weapon of war against Palestinians, and what we know in terms of that, since the New York Times article specifically focused on Hamas sexually using rape as a weapon of war on October 7th. I was wondering if we had any reports of the IDF essentially performing the same war crimes on Palestinian civilians.
So the IDF is heavily involved in the occupation of the West Bank, which is the region for everyone, that region around Jerusalem, between Jordan, Jerusalem, and Megiddo and the Negev Desert. It's kind of, it was supposed to be a Palestinian enclave. It hasn't been since 1967. It's effectively been occupied. What happens is, and we have a number of reports, they don't really make our news that often. There have been a huge amount of reports of Palestinian individuals taken into prison and then sexually abused there in prison, either by prison guards or by the IDF. It is a problem. It's not talked about. I have seen a couple articles recently come out because a lot more attention is being paid since October 7th.
And these articles are specifically about the IDF's treatment of Palestinians instead of the okay.
Yes. We did a big portion on not generally speaking the targeting in Gaza, but like I haven't focused directly on that issue that much, but I know that those have been brought forward by other people to talk about the overall situation. Um, it's it gets lost a little bit in a kind of case of he said she said, because a lot of the dialogue around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is very charged and very interested in protecting your own side, rather than the more pertinent answer of there are no good guys here.
That's a fair point. And I will be honest with you, I don't think that my initial knee-jerk reaction is to be more sympathetic to the Palestinians, given like the scale of death that has happened. But I'll be blunt in that I know very little about the history of the region, very little about the history of the conflict, and not enough nearly to give any sort of an educated opinion on this. But what I do want to know is, like, I guess I would like to know, like, do you have a firm opinion about this? Like, what is it that you have learned about this conflict over the past few months? Or if there is any insight that you could give. One question that I have for you is like the coverage of what's happening. Most of the coverage that I've actually seen has been fairly pro-Israel, even though like I'm seeing lots of videos of kids on campus protesting, in favor of Palestine.
Talking about Israel is a very complicated topic. It's also guaranteed to make people angry.
Yeah.
So Israel, from the outset of this conflict, 1948, when Israel is founded, this is a continuation of a bitter conflict that had been happening since the 30s, and some will argue since 1917, the kind of breakup of the Ottoman Empire and the land reforms that kind of makes Israel possible. Both sides have, in the course of this is 90 years now, committed a number of atrocities. But I ultimately, I cannot bring myself to say that. The only thing I can bring myself to say again and again is that I want to see people live. I don't want to see them die. I don't want to see Palestinians die. I don't want to see Israelis die. And these are people who have so very much in common, as nearly as much as they have differences. That like the right answer is to find a way to stop killing people, to find an equitable solution. We're obviously talking about sharing things that are immensely important. And that's kind of the answer. I sympathize immensely with the Palestinian people. The situation that they're in, they're dispossessed, not wanted in other Arab countries. They are not the masters of their own homes. The Arab people in the West Bank, the Palestinians in the West Bank, cannot walk down the street secure in the ability to leave their neighborhood because there are Israeli checkpoints. So it's an incredibly difficult situation. We've seen now close to 25 years of a peace process that has been totally one-sided. There was, particularly when Trump moved the embassy, I saw a couple articles that talked about how the United States has never been a good broker for the Palestinian people, how we've always backed Israel. And institutionally, that's true. We have, from the get-go, backed Israel. I have been working on a video essay for this exact same topic, the peace process, what the two-state solution entails, and why Palestine couldn't accept it, because it would give them, it would be the same thing as they live under now, just it would formalize their dispossession. But
so then, do you think that are you then in favor of a one-state solution then? If you think that a two-state solution isn't, it would effectively be the same as it would have been prior to the attack.
A true two-state solution would make a Palestinian nation that is capable of defending itself, is capable of asserting and building its own economy. To be frank, there is no natural economic evolution for Gaza and the West Bank. It's principle. The CIA fact sheet lists off they have no heavy industry. Their entire economy is agriculture and tourism based. Uh,
Mhm.
so, as far as I'm concerned, the only viable solution is a single state solution in which Palestinians and Israelis work together. Because the two-state solution just leaves a Palestinian state that will fail. And I
Mhm.
don't think so. Even if you had the most ideal two-state solution for it,
Mhm.
you wouldn't necessarily get you wouldn't necessarily get success.
Mhm.
And obviously the one-state solution is Israel won't accept it. Israel has become a hardline right-wing country over the past
Mhm.
60 years, since the 70s, really. So about 50 years. Uh, even 67. Like
Mhm.
leftism in Israel died after the 6 Days War.
Why do you think that is? And I don't know about the 6 Days War, so you'd have to inform me what that was.
So the 6 Days War took 6 days. We actually named that one right. And it was a case where Israel preemptively attacked the Egyptian military, the Syrians, and the Jordanians. And this is where they took the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights and most of the Sinai Peninsula at that time as well. And like Egypt was probably planning on attacking Israel. So the idea was that like the government, which had been had been much more leftist than it was now today. Like Israel kind
Mhm.
of was a much stronger welfare state at this point. Had
Mhm.
dropped the ball at defending people. So a lot of the commanders in the 6 Day War are names you would recognize as
Mhm.
prime minister, like Ariel Sharon. So like this is kind of like the ascension of the right wing in Israel too. Like they are the heroes of the moment for Israeli people.
Mhm.
It's a stunning military victory. They cause hundreds of thousands of casualties on the Egyptians. It's such a severe defeat that the Egyptian president is temporarily forced to resign. Um, it's a huge event for them, a watershed event in the Arab-Israeli war. It
Mhm.
brings about, like, for example, the United Nations resolutions. Uh, the United Nations resolutions that uh, inform the peace process today. This assertion that Israel cannot occupy places like the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights. So it's a
Mhm.
pivotal moment in understanding the conflict. Um, it also is a pivotal moment for when the people, like when Israelis' attitude changes. Uh, it's what allows the creation of things like Likud, the party of Benjamin Netanyahu, um, to
Mhm.
happen. So it's a big it's a very big event. There's a couple points in Israeli history that are definitely worth stopping by, but that's one of them.
Mhm. I know that you have a chatter that's been itching to ask you a question. I'm so sorry. I know we've been kind of engaged this past hour, this past couple of hours. Did he have a question by chance?
It's a couple comments. Commander McMillan, yeah, technically, legally, there's no reason why women couldn't be drafted. The issue is cultural. People today can accept the idea of volunteering but not being forced in the service. Also, he thinks that we're not going to war with China. I hope so. I stopped
Yeah.
making those predictions after my Ukraine predictions, because I got it was a long winter at that time, but that's beside the point.
Okay. All right. Well, Daedalus, this has been an excellent conversation. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you talking to me, especially after the fire that was last week. So I really appreciate you coming and like informing and like rehabilitating some of that discourse. Is there anything that you wish that we could have talked about that we didn't get to today?
No, you pretty much got to most of my stuff. Actually, I had a little cheat sheet I made, and we're all there. So I appreciate you having me on and you doing this again. It's a good. Anyone who hasn't, consider subscribing to Fairy Queen. Sure, link is in my description. Um,
Thank you.
uh, and like this stream, please, because it helps us out here too.
Absolutely. And I'll be dropping your link as well in my chat as well. Thank you very much, Daedalus. I really, really appreciate you and have an excellent night.
You
Thank
too.
you.
Have a good one.
Absolutely. Bye.
Okie dokie. That went pretty well. I don't ask questions. I have annoying opinions. Oh, no, that we all keep each other around for annoying opinions, sir. All right, I am going to. Avery's giving me a look like he wants to go potty, so I'm gonna hang it up here. I want to thank everybody for showing up today. Turn back in Wednesday while we talk about the Articles of Confederation.